"Sir, I need you to step back from that register for a second. This transaction matches a flagged card," the store manager said, his voice firm but controlled, cutting through the low hum of scanners and quiet conversation as every head within 20 feet turned at once toward the front counter where Marcus Ellison stood in a navy apron, one hand still hovering over the keypad, the other holding a receipt that suddenly felt heavier than it should. The beep of a nearby checkout froze mid-rhythm. A child's question went unanswered, and even the automatic doors seemed to hesitate half open as the manager, Thomas Greer, stepped closer with a tablet in hand, angling the screen just enough to show a string of red text and a blurred still image that, at a glance, could have been anyone in a uniform like Marcus's, same build, same posture, same color apron. "We had a report 10 minutes ago," Greer continued, not raising his voice, not accusing outright, but placing the words carefully in the space between them where customers could hear. "Unauthorized use, same terminal area, same employee description." And that was enough, the air tightening as a woman 2 lines over leaned slightly to get a clearer view, her cartwheels squeaking softly as she shifted her weight, while a man behind Marcus adjusted his grip on a gallon of milk, eyes flicking from Marcus's face to the manager's tablet and back again. Marcus blinked once, a brief pause that stretched just long enough for him to register the attention gathering around him, the subtle circle forming without anyone stepping forward, just the invisible boundary of curiosity and judgment closing in, and he felt the urge to explain rise quickly and just as quickly stall, because anything said too fast would sound defensive, and anything said too slow would sound uncertain. "I have been on this register all morning," he replied, voice even, measured, the kind of tone built from years of customer service where calm mattered more than being heard, his eyes staying level with Greer's rather than dropping or darting. But he could feel the shift behind him, the way silence had replaced the normal rhythm of small talk and barcode scans. Greer nodded once, not dismissive, not convinced, simply continuing to hold the space. "I understand, but I need to verify before we proceed," his hand gesturing lightly toward the terminal, a small movement that still carried authority, directing the flow of the moment without force, and Marcus followed it instinctively, stepping half an inch back from the counter, creating just enough distance to signal cooperation while maintaining his place, his posture straight, shoulders relaxed, but not loose, a controlled stillness that read as professional even as a flicker of discomfort passed through his jaw and disappeared. Somewhere near the entrance, a phone lifted slightly, then lowered again, as if the person holding it was unsure whether this moment was worth recording, and a cashier at the next lane slowed her scanning without stopping entirely, the beeps now spaced farther apart, like a heartbeat under pressure. Greer tapped his tablet, eyes moving quickly across the screen. Then back to Marcus. "Just stay right there," he said, not unkind, but final enough that no one mistook who was guiding the interaction, and Marcus nodded once, a small acknowledgement that held more weight than it should have, because staying meant waiting, and waiting meant being watched. If this moment pulled you in, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments what time you are watching this and where you are watching from, because right now, in this quiet pocket of a grocery store that suddenly felt too bright and too still, everything was about to hinge on what came next. Marcus kept his hands resting lightly at the edge of the register, not gripping, not pulling away, just letting them stay where they had been a moment ago, as if nothing had shifted, though the rhythm around him had not returned to normal. The scanner to his left resumed with a soft beep, then another, slower than before, each sound spaced out just enough to feel deliberate, while the woman with the cart in the adjacent lane pretended to study a candy display that she had already passed, her eyes flicking up in brief intervals that lingered a fraction longer each time. Marcus glanced once at the screen in front of him, not to read anything specific, but to give his gaze somewhere to land, then reached for the next item in his lane, a bottle of orange juice, lifting it with steady fingers, the label slightly damp from condensation, his movement precise but not rushed, as if maintaining the usual pace might restore something that had slipped. The receipt printer clicked quietly beside him, spitting out a narrow strip of paper that curled at the edge, and he tore it cleanly, the motion practiced, though his timing was off by a beat, just enough that the customer standing across from him hesitated before taking it, their fingers brushing for a second longer than necessary before pulling back. Behind Marcus, a cart will squeaked again, then stopped abruptly, and somewhere near the entrance a low conversation resumed but stayed muted, like voices carried through a closed door. Thomas Greer stood a few feet away, angled slightly toward his tablet, scrolling with his thumb, his posture unchanged, shoulders squared, attention fixed on the screen rather than the room, as if the moment that had drawn everyone in had already been categorized and filed, no longer requiring his awareness. Marcus shifted his weight subtly from one foot to the other, a small adjustment that redistributed the tension in his stance, then reached for a paper bag, opening it with a quick snap that sounded louder than usual in the stretched quiet, placing the items inside one by one, aligning them carefully so nothing tipped, his movements controlled, deliberate, each action finishing cleanly before the next began. The customer in front of him cleared their throat, not impatient, just uncertain, and Marcus nodded once in acknowledgement without lifting his eyes, sliding the bag forward across the counter with a gentle push, the bottom brushing against the smooth surface. A child in the next lane asked a question in a whisper, their voice barely audible, and the adult beside them responded with a soft hush, not harsh, just enough to keep the sound contained. Marcus's gaze lifted briefly toward the overhead lights, then returned to the register, his breathing steady, shoulders settling a fraction lower as he recalibrated his pace, matching the slowed environment rather than resisting it. Another item scanned, another receipt printed, and the line began to move again, though not quite at its original tempo, each interaction carrying a trace of the attention that had not fully dissipated. A man near the exit paused with his hand on the door, glancing back once more before stepping outside, letting the door swing closed. Behind him with a soft thud, Marcus reached for the next customer's items, his fingers brushing the edge of a cardboard box, adjusting his grip before lifting it, the motion smoother this time, more certain, as if he had found a rhythm within the disruption, even while the air around him still held a faint, lingering awareness that had yet to fade completely. The line moved forward by inches, but the space around Marcus did not quite follow, as if the flow of the store had split into two rhythms, one continuing as usual, and another hovering just a step behind him. A customer set a carton of eggs on the belt with more care than necessary, aligning it twice before letting go, their eyes lifting briefly toward Marcus and then dropping to the divider bar, fingers tapping once against the plastic before going still. Marcus reached for the carton, his grip firm but measured, thumbs adjusting along the edge before he scanned it, the beep coming clean, though his hand lingered a fraction longer than needed before placing it into the bag. Behind the counter, the overhead lights hummed softly, a constant that suddenly felt louder in the stretched quiet between interactions, and he found himself glancing once toward the reflection in the small convex mirror mounted above the aisle, catching a warped image of himself and the customers behind him, their shapes slightly curved but unmistakably oriented in his direction. Thomas Greer remained near the end of the counter, shifting his weight casually as he scrolled through his tablet, occasionally tapping the screen with a steady, unhurried rhythm, his posture unchanged, his presence anchoring the space without acknowledging it, as if the earlier interruption had already resolved in his mind and required no further attention. Marcus reached for a stack of paper bags, separating one with a quick flick of his wrist, though the edges stuck together for a moment, forcing him to try again, slower this time. The second attempt clean, the bag opening with a soft rustle that seemed to draw a glance from the man waiting at the end of the lane. The man's gaze did not hold long, but it returned a second later, more deliberate, as if confirming something, before shifting back to the items in his cart. Marcus placed a box of cereal into the bag, then paused just long enough to adjust its position, turning it so the weight balanced evenly, a small correction that kept his movements precise, controlled, leaving no room for hesitation to show. Somewhere to his right, a cashier laughed lightly at a comment from a coworker, the sound brief and slightly out of place, fading quickly as if it had entered the wrong room. Marcus's fingers hovered over the keypad for a second before pressing the next sequence. The numbers entered accurately, though his timing lagged by a beat that only he seemed to register. A woman stepping up to the counter slowed her approach, her shoes making a soft scuff against the tile, as she stopped just short of the usual distance, giving him a wider space than necessary. Her eyes flicking once toward Thomas before settling on the card reader. Marcus nodded to her, a small acknowledgement, his expression steady, his shoulders squared, and he guided the next transaction forward with the same measured tone. You can insert or tap whenever you are ready. His voice even, unstrained, though his gaze stayed anchored just below her eye line. Focused on the process rather than the person, Thomas shifted a step closer to the terminal, not intervening, just observing the screen as if checking a detail. His presence enough to tighten the air again without a word, and Marcus adjusted his stance. Subtly, feet repositioning for balance. The movement barely visible, but enough to ground himself before continuing. The receipt printed, curling outward, and Marcus tore it cleanly this time, the motion smooth. Practiced, his hand steady as he placed it on the counter. The woman took it with a brief nod, her fingers brushing the paper and then pulling back quickly, her shoulders turning away before her feet followed, leaving the space in front of him open again but not empty. Because the attention had not fully left, it had only thinned, stretching across the room in quieter threads that still pointed back to him. Marcus reached for the next item, his movements now more consistent, each action landing with quiet precision, not rushed, not delayed, as if he had found a way to move within the weight rather than against it. Even while the awareness of being watched lingered just beneath the surface, steady and unresolved. The next customer set down a small stack of items, a bottle of water, a sandwich, and a pack of batteries, and Marcus reached for them in the same steady rhythm he had rebuilt, scanning each one cleanly, the beeps landing evenly until the card reader chimed with a soft decline, a flat tone that carried just far enough to be noticed. The customer hesitated, glancing at the screen, then back at Marcus. It should go through, she said quietly, already reaching to try again, but Marcus's fingers hovered just above the keypad, not pressing anything, not stepping back either. A brief pause settling into his shoulders as he glanced once toward the terminal, then toward the woman's card still in her hand, and then, just for a fraction of a second, toward the far end of the counter where Thomas stood. The moment stretched, not long, but long enough to register. Long enough for the man behind her to shift his weight and for the faint hum of the lights to press in again, and then Marcus made a small adjustment, subtle but clear, tapping the screen once to bypass the immediate retry and selecting a manual option that moved the transaction forward without waiting for another card attempt. It was a minor deviation, a routine override used in certain cases, but one that stepped just outside the expected sequence, and it happened in full view, without announcement, without asking for confirmation. The receipt began to print, curling out with a soft mechanical rhythm. And the woman blinked, surprised, her hand lowering slightly as she watched the paper emerge. Across the counter, a pair of eyes lifted and held, then another, the attention sharpening, focusing not on the earlier tension but on this small shift in control. Thomas's thumb stopped mid-scroll on his tablet, the motion freezing for a beat before he lifted his head, his gaze settling directly on the terminal, then on Marcus's hands, his posture tightening just enough to signal a change, not dramatic, but deliberate. He took a step closer, closing the distance by a few feet, the sound of his shoes on the tile measured and unhurried. And when he spoke, his voice remained level. Do not complete that transaction yet. The words placed cleanly into the space between them, not loud, but carrying. Marcus's hand, already moving to tear the receipt, paused mid-motion, the paper still feeding through the printer, and he held there for a fraction of a second before letting it finish, the strips separating cleanly as he pulled it free. His shoulders lifted slightly with a controlled breath, then settled again as he placed the receipt on the counter without sliding it forward, his fingers releasing it carefully rather than dropping it. The woman looked between them, uncertain, her card still in her hand, while the man behind her leaned forward just enough to see the screen, then stopped himself, pulling back without stepping away. The air tightened again, not with noise but with focus, the kind that gathered in small movements, a pause in a neighboring lane. A glance held a second longer than usual. A cart left stationary with one wheel angled outward. Marcus adjusted his stance, shifting his weight evenly between his feet, his hands returning to a neutral position near the register, not retreating, not advancing. his gaze steady on the screen rather than on Thomas, maintaining the same professional posture he had held all along, though the line of his jaw firmed slightly before easing back into place. Thomas's presence filled the space beside the terminal now, his attention fixed, his control reasserted without raising his voice, and for a moment the entire interaction seemed to hold in suspension, balanced between what had been done and what would be allowed to stand, with Marcus remaining still at the center of it, composed, measured, and unmistakably under watch. Thomas did not move his gaze from the terminal, his presence now fixed beside Marcus like a boundary that had been drawn in place, and when he spoke again, his voice carried just enough to reach the edges of the small crowd that had quietly formed. "Cancel it and restart the process," he said, not raising his tone, but leaving no space for interpretation, his hand lowering slightly toward the screen as if directing the next step without touching it. The receipt still lay on the counter, untouched, its edge lifting faintly in the conditioned air, and the woman across from Marcus shifted her weight, her fingers tightening slightly around her card as she looked from the paper to Marcus and then to Thomas, waiting without saying anything. Marcus's hand hovered near the keypad again, not pressing, not withdrawing, his fingers slightly curved as if holding an invisible position. And for a brief second his gaze dropped to the receipt, then lifted back to the screen, the movement, small but deliberate, as if measuring the distance between what had already been done and what was being asked now. Behind the woman, the man with the milk leaned forward just enough to see the display, then stilled, his posture caught between curiosity and restraint, while somewhere to the left, a scanner beeped and then stopped mid-sequence, the cashier there pausing with an item half-raised before continuing more slowly. Thomas remained still, his silence extending just long enough to press the moment further, and then, with a slight tilt of his head, he added, "Now," the single word landing with more weight than a longer instruction, drawing the attention of those nearby tighter into the space between them. Marcus inhaled once, controlled, his shoulders lifting barely an inch before settling again, and his thumb moved toward the keypad, stopping just short of contact as his eyes flicked once to the transaction total still displayed, then to the manual override indicator he had triggered moments before, and then, briefly, to the woman's hand still holding her card. The choice sat there in the open, visible not in words but in the pause itself, because canceling would erase the action he had already taken, resetting the process under Thomas's direction, while continuing would mean completing the transaction without that confirmation, leaving the decision to stand on its own. The silence stretched, not empty but filled with the soft sounds of the store continuing at a distance, a cart, wheel rolling, a door opening and closing, voices kept low, all of it framing the stillness at the counter where no one moved forward and no one stepped away. Marcus's fingers shifted slightly, adjusting their position on the edge of the keypad, and then, with a measured motion, he pressed a sequence that did not cancel the transaction, his hand steady as he confirmed the override and finalized the sale. The screen updating with a soft chime that cut cleanly through the quiet. The receipt, already on the counter, became final in that moment, no longer pending, and Marcus lifted it again, this time sliding it forward toward the woman with a controlled, even motion, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. The woman hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, her fingers brushing the paper quickly, her shoulders turning as if to leave, but pausing just long enough to glance once more toward Thomas, then back to Marcus, before stepping away. Thomas did not step back immediately, his eyes remaining on the terminal as the completed transaction displayed, his jaw tightening just slightly before relaxing again. And then he exhaled through his nose, a controlled release that carried more meaning in its restraint than in any raised voice. He reached out and tapped the side of the register lightly, not forcefully, but enough to draw Marcus's attention back to him without speaking, and when Marcus's gaze met his, Thomas held it for a beat, his expression composed, his authority intact. "We will address this," he said, the words quiet but clear, not a question, not a suggestion, and then he turned his attention back to the tablet in his hand as if the outcome had already been noted. Around them, the air shifted again, not easing, but settling into a heavier stillness, the kind that followed a decision rather than preceded it. and the line began to move once more, though slower. Each person stepping forward with a slight hesitation before placing their items on the counter. Marcus adjusted his stance, feet aligning squarely beneath him, his hands returning to their neutral position near the scanner, and he reached for the next item without rushing, his movements precise, controlled, though the space around him now carried a different weight, one shaped not just by observation but by consequence, visible in the way a customer placed their items more carefully, in the way another avoided direct eye contact, in the way the rhythm of the store continued but never quite returned to what it had been before. The line continued to move, but the motion felt softened, as if each step forward had to pass through something thicker than before, and Marcus reached for the next item, a loaf of bread in a thin plastic bag, lifting it with care and placing it on the scanner, the beep quiet and clean, his hand lingering a fraction longer before sliding it into the bag. He paused briefly between items, not enough to stop the flow, just enough to create a small space in his movements, a measured rhythm that replaced the earlier urgency, and his fingers adjusted the edge of the bag twice before settling, smoothing it down with a light press. Across from him, the customer watched without speaking, their eyes steady but not fixed, shifting once to the terminal and back again, while behind them, a cart rolled forward slowly, its wheels turning with a soft, uneven sound that filled the gaps between interactions. Marcus's gaze lifted for a moment, not toward anyone in particular, but just above the line of sight, catching the reflection of the overhead lights on the polished surface of the register, then lowering again as he reached for a bottle, rotating it slightly before scanning, aligning it carefully inside the bag, as if each placement mattered more than it had before. Thomas stood a few feet to the side now, no longer as close to the terminal, but not fully withdrawn, his tablet held lower, his attention shifting between the screen and the register in short intervals, his eyes pausing on Marcus's hands for a beat longer each time before moving away again, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. The surrounding lanes carried on, but their rhythm remained uneven. A cashier nearby slowed her scanning just enough to create space between each beep, and a customer at the end of the aisle glanced over once, then again, before turning back to their own transaction. Marcus reached for the receipt as it printed, his hand stopping just short of tearing it for a brief second, then continuing with a smooth motion, placing it on the counter with a slight adjustment so it lay flat, his fingertips brushing the surface before pulling back. His shoulders shifted subtly, a small roll that released a trace of tension before settling again, and he repositioned his feet under the counter, aligning them squarely as if grounding himself in place. The next item came through, a box of cereal, and he scanned it with the same steady motion, though his breath paused at the top for a moment before easing out, barely visible in the rise and fall of his chest. Thomas glanced up again, his gaze holding on the register just a second longer than before, then returning to the tablet without comment, his silence stretching across the space like a held note. The air remained quiet, not empty, but filled with small, contained sounds, a distant door opening, a faint murmur of conversation, the soft rustle of bags, all of it continuing around Marcus without breaking the stillness that lingered closest to him. And he continued working within it, each movement deliberate, controlled, the rhythm slower but steady, as if the moment had not passed, only settled into something that had yet to resolve. The next transaction began without interruption, Marcus scanning a bottle of soda and placing it into a bag with the same measured precision, when a sharp, distinct chime cut through the air from somewhere behind the counter, different from the usual register tones, higher, insistent, and it repeated twice in quick succession. Thomas's thumb froze mid-scroll again, but this time he did not look at Marcus first, his head turning toward the service desk at the far end of the store where a small screen mounted above the counter flashed red, then shifted to a live camera feed. A clerk behind the desk leaned forward, squinting at the monitor, then tapped something quickly, causing the image to expand, and the movement drew attention, one head turning, then another, until the focus that had lingered around Marcus began to drift in that direction. The feed showed the front entrance from 10 minutes earlier, time-stamped in the corner, and a figure stepped into view, wearing the same navy apron, same build, same posture at a glance, but the camera angle caught the face clearly as the person turned toward the self-checkout lanes, And it was not Marcus. The clerk pointed at the screen, calling out without raising her voice. That is the flagged transaction. And a second employee stepped closer, nodding once as they watched the sequence replay, the person on screen swiping a card, pausing, then moving quickly out of frame. Thomas shifted his stance, his shoulders tightening as he watched, his tablet lowering slightly in his hand. And for a moment he did not move, his attention fixed entirely on the footage. The man with the milk near Marcus's lane turned fully toward the service desk now, his earlier focus broken, while the woman who had just completed her purchase slowed near the exit, glancing back as the quiet pull of attention redirected across the room. Marcus continued scanning, his hands steady as he processed the next item, a carton of juice, placing it carefully into the bag, his movements unchanged even as the environment shifted. The clerk rewound the footage once more, pausing at a frame where the person's name tag caught the light, the letters visible just long enough to read, "Not Marcus," and she tapped the screen again, enlarging the image. Thomas took a step toward the service desk, then stopped halfway, his gaze flicking back to Marcus for a brief second before returning to the monitor. The rhythm of his movement interrupted, his control no longer centered on the register. A second chime sounded from the system, this time followed by a confirmation tone, and the clerk spoke again, clearer now. The flag card was used at self-checkout 3, not this register, her words carrying across the space without force, but with enough clarity to land. The air shifted again, more noticeably this time, the weight that had settled around Marcus lifting just enough to change the direction of every glance, eyes moving away from him and toward the screen, toward the source of the discrepancy. The customer in front of Marcus hesitated before stepping forward, placing their items on the counter with a softer motion, their attention no longer fixed on him but divided, and Marcus reached for the first item, scanning it with the same controlled pace, the beep landing cleanly. Thomas stood still for a moment longer, his tablet now lowered completely at his side, his gaze moving between the monitor and the register as if recalibrating the space, and when he finally shifted his weight, it was slower, less certain than before, his posture no longer anchoring the interaction but reacting to it. The line at Marcus's lane resumed a more natural rhythm, subtle but noticeable, the hesitation and movement easing as customers stepped forward without the same pause, and the quiet hum of the store began to fill the gaps again. Marcus tore the next receipt cleanly, sliding it across the counter with a steady hand, his posture unchanged, his focus returning fully to the process in front of him. Even as the center of attention had moved away, the earlier assumption now displaced by a detail that could be seen, verified, and no longer aligned with him. Thomas remained still for a moment longer than expected, his attention fixed on the service desk screen even after the clerk had stepped back, and when he finally moved, it was not toward Marcus but halfway between the register and the desk, as if recalculating where he needed to be. His hand lifted slightly with the tablet, then lowered again without tapping, the motion incomplete. Before he turned his head back toward Marcus's lane, his gaze landing there with a different weight, no longer anchoring but measuring. Marcus continued scanning, lifting a bottle of iced tea and passing it cleanly over the scanner, the beep steady, placing it into the bag with the same careful alignment as before, his movements unchanged, his posture consistent, his attention fixed on the items in front of him rather than the shift happening around him. A customer who had been watching the screen now turned back toward the counter, stepping forward without the earlier hesitation, placing their items down in a smoother motion, their eyes briefly meeting Marcus's before dropping to the card reader, the interaction resetting without needing to be stated. Thomas took a step closer to the register, slower than before, his pace no longer directive, and he stopped just short of where he had stood earlier, leaving a small gap between himself and the terminal, his fingers adjusting their grip on the tablet, then releasing it to his side entirely, the screen dimming as it tilted away. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then paused, the moment holding for a fraction longer than necessary, before he shifted his weight and glanced once more toward the service desk, confirming what had already been shown, and then back to Marcus. The line continued to move, the rhythm more even now, a scanner in the next lane returning to its regular cadence, and a low conversation resumed near the entrance, the sound filling in the space that had previously been held in silence. Marcus tore another receipt, sliding it forward with a steady hand, his fingers brushing the counter briefly before pulling back, and he nodded once to the customer. His expression neutral, professional, unchanged. Thomas's gaze followed the movement of Marcus's hands, then lifted slightly to meet his face, holding there for a brief second before shifting away again, his shoulders settling a fraction lower, though his posture remained upright, controlled. He reached toward the terminal as if to check something, then stopped just short of touching it, his hand hovering for a moment before dropping back to his side, the action restrained, incomplete, signaling a change without fully committing to it. A customer behind the counter adjusted their position, stepping closer, without the earlier pause, and another placed their items down with a softer motion. The collective attention no longer centered entirely on Marcus, but still aware of the space around him. Thomas finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, directed more narrowly. "Continue," he said, the words simple, but different in tone, less about instruction and more about acknowledgement of what was already happening. Marcus did not respond verbally, his hands already moving to scan the next item. Maintaining the same measured pace, his focus steady, his posture unchanged, Thomas remained there for another second, then stepped back slightly, creating more space between himself and the register, his attention no longer fixed in the same way. Though he did not fully disengage, his presence still within the scene but no longer controlling it. The store's rhythm settled further, the earlier tension thinning into a quieter awareness, visible in the way customers moved more naturally, in the way glances became shorter, less pointed, and Marcus continued working within it, consistent and composed, while the balance of the space shifted around him, no longer held by a single direction of control. Thomas remained beside the lane for one last moment, his gaze moving from the register to Marcus's hands as another item passed cleanly over the scanner, the sound landing steady and familiar, and then he reached forward, this time completing the motion he had stopped earlier, tapping a small sequence on the terminal that brought up the transaction log. His finger paused just above the screen before pressing confirm, and the system updated quietly, clearing the earlier flag from the register, the red indicator disappearing without sound. He did not announce it, but the change was visible, and the clerk at the service desk glanced over, then returned to her work without calling out again. Thomas straightened, his shoulders settling, and instead of stepping away immediately, he turned slightly toward Marcus, leaving a small space open between them, his posture no longer blocking the lane. "You are good here," he said, the words short, directed, and different in weight from before, his voice steady but no longer carrying across the room. Marcus did not respond, his hands already moving to scan the next item, placing it into the bag with the same measured care, his focus unchanged, his posture consistent. The customer at the counter completed their payment without hesitation, tapping their card and stepping aside in a smooth motion, and the next person moved forward naturally, setting their items down without the earlier pause. Around them, the store settled fully back into its rhythm, the scanners returning to a steady cadence, a conversation near the entrance picking up with a light laugh, and the cart that had been angled awkwardly earlier now rolling straight down the aisle. A man who had been watching turned away completely, pushing his cart toward the exit, and another customer adjusted their position in line, no longer leaving extra space at the counter. Thomas stepped back 2 full paces, clearing the immediate area around the register, and turned his attention to the tablet again. Though his grip was looser now, his stance less fixed, Marcus tore another receipt, sliding it across the counter with a clean, practiced motion, his fingers brushing the edge before pulling back, and he nodded once to the customer, his expression steady, unchanged from the moment before. The lane moved forward, one transaction into the next, and the space that had once held the tension now carried only the ordinary flow of the store, the earlier weight reduced to something quieter, almost unnoticeable. Thomas remained at a distance, no longer directing, no longer intervening, his presence part of the background rather than the center, and Marcus continued working within the lane, consistent and composed, the pattern restored without needing to be stated. The final detail lingered in the small gap Thomas had left at the counter, a clear space where he had once stood, now empty as the line moved through it without pause. If this moment stayed with you, share what you felt and consider subscribing for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.